All right, we're live.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Torah Made Flesh. I'm your host, Daniel. And as always, I have with me Trey.
Shalom. Glad to be here another week.
You know, that's right. How was your Shabbat?
Oh, it was great. I got to hang out with my family because I'm home this week.
That's awesome, man. That's very awesome. Well, I want to introduce our guest tonight. We have Rabbi Steve Berkson from M.T.O.I with us. How you doing, Rabbi?
I'm doing good, Always.
Torah Made Flesh. I'm your host, Daniel. You're gonna have to pause your speakers.
Shalom. Glad to be here another week.
You know, that's right. How was your Shabbat?
Oh, it was great. I got to hang out with my family. I think he's watching us.
Are you watching us? You're gonna have to pause. I'm introduce our guest tonight. We have Rabbi Steve Berkson from M.T.O.I with us. How you doing, Rabbi?
I'm doing good, Always.
Torah Made Flesh. I'm your host, Daniel. You're gonna have to pause your.
I got a strange loop going here.
Shalom. Glad to be here another week.
Are you trying to watch it while you're on it?
I got to hang out with my family. I think he's watching us.
I'm not watching anything.
I'll introduce our guest tonight. We have Rabbi Steve Berkson from M.T.O.I with us. How you doing, Rabbi? Hey, Trey, we might have to. Did you find it? Find out what was going on?
Seems like it's all good now.
Yeah. All right, let me see if I get. Okay, I'm back here. Okay, sorry about all that confusion. I have no idea what that was, but I just closed everything I could on my computer, thinking if it was anything on my end. But
okay, well, we're glad we're good now.
Yeah, we're good now. Well, anyway, I've already introduced you. They've probably heard it 3 times. So how are you doing this week?
Hey, listen, it would not be a Torah Made Flesh if we didn't have some sort of technical hiccup at the beginning, right?
Every single week.
Yeah.
See, I think people look forward to that, so they want to see what new hiccup we can come up with each week.
Yeah, no, that's for sure.
Technology. So wonderful. So wonderful. Anyway, I did want to ask.
I'm doing good, and I'm glad to be here, and I'm also glad to be one of the guests that gets to come and demonstrate that I'm a real person, and you can see this disastrous mess that I use for an office. See, I don't even try to pretend and put like a blue screen behind me or something, but at least, you know.
Rabbis are real people too.
That's right. We have just as messy a life as anybody else.
That's right. Oh yeah. I finally got rid of the black curtains, so you know. But anyway.
Right.
Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Sweet. Well, folks, you're in for a real treat tonight. Since Passover's coming up, we wanted to do an episode about Passover and some of the questions that people have coming into this walk and what it looks like for us to observe Passover. Some of the nuances throughout it that we read through Scripture that maybe you've had some questions about. I know I've had questions about. So we're going to get right into it with him. And first, before we hit the Passover, before we get to the Passover thing, I wanted him to kind of plug what he's doing now at M.T.O.I as far as the covenant community and let people know what's kind of going on with that, because I think that's going to be a great series, especially for people new to the Torah walk. So if you would, can you give them a little bit of insight of what you're doing, where that's going to kind of take you?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we get a lot of questions over the years for you know, how do we get started in this? You know, what do we do as a brand new person, or where would I start a brand new person? What kind of teaching? And so I decided that I was going to do a series that was called Covenant Community 101. One of the things I've taught and I teach on a regular basis is that the whole big picture that the fathers put together is all a picture of a community, a family, a group of people that would live together forever. And so I've chosen to use the phrase covenant community. And so what is the covenant community? What does it look like? How does it function? What things do they do? What don't they do? How do they interact with each other? And so we just started this series a couple of weeks ago. We're on the 3rd part that we did this week. 2 weeks ago, I did an intro that's already been posted on the internet. And last week before that, I did what's called the journey. And then yesterday, we did a beginning of dealing with our identity issues. And so we're hoping to cover a lot of the very first things that people might need to go into, including what we're going to talk about tonight, which is the Passover. in the context of talking about all of the feasts, all of the Moedim, and things like Shabbat, kashrut, kosher issues and things. Once you start to realize that there's more than what you were maybe just raised with, if you were raised in a church system, if you were raised just in the world and didn't have anything, getting started is always a tough thing. So we're trying to address that, from the perspective of a new person getting started.
Yeah, I know I've been enjoying it. And I just wanted you to let everybody know what was going on with that, because I think it's a great teaching tool for, especially, like I said, those who's just now coming in and even those who's been in it for a few years. But let's get right to the point. Passover, it's coming up next month. What does that look like as for believers in the Messiah that have come into Torah and now know these things, read these things in our scriptures? What was that an original only one-time event, or are we observing it throughout our generations like it says?
Okay, so Passover, even for a new person, is one of the few of the feasts that everybody is mostly familiar with, because, of course, of the movies like the Ten Commandments and all of the other even newer movies that deal with the whole Exodus out of Egypt story. And so this is something that most people are at least aware of from the Bible, and they've learned from their time they were a little child. On the other hand, the relevance to them today has not always been clear. Christianity has, in essence, replaced the observance of Passover with the observance of Easter. Okay, so they focus on their understanding of the resurrection and the day of resurrection. And we don't necessarily need to get into that tonight, but it's my belief that it was on Saturday afternoon, not Sunday morning, that he resurrected. Of course, nobody was there to see that until they showed up Sunday morning to see that. But the thing is, they focused their attention on the resurrection and have missed the events that lead right up to the resurrection, which is the Passover events. Now, it is relevant because if we go to Leviticus chapter 23, and again, this is why I'm dealing with the identity issues teaching in the last, just started this week. If you identify and understand that the people of Elohim, the people of the Creator, when he says, my people, that verse, anywhere you see that verse written, is referring to Israel. Now, we have to relax and not say, oh, well, that's the Jews. No, it's not the Jews. They're just 1/12 of that, plus the mixed multitude that graft into that. The same thing happened as they came out of Egypt. When they were in Egypt, they were the 12 tribes. As they came out, we're told that they came out with a mixed multitude of people that were fleeing the destruction in Egypt. And eventually, by the time they crossed the Jordan 40 years later, there is no more mixed multitude. They've assimilated in or grafted in and become Israel. And so that's a precursor to understanding the feast, because when we read Leviticus 23, we hear that these are the feasts of Yahweh, and they're to be observed by Israel. And so, of course, if you don't see yourself as Israel, you don't see them as being relevant. So let's assume for a second that you've already studied this out and understand that these feasts are for Israel, and that the idea is that you're supposed to be Israel. And if you don't understand that, then follow along with this teaching I just started this last week. It'll be posted next week on the internet, or you can watch the live stream from yesterday. And once we assume that we understand that we're supposed to be Israel, then we realize the feasts that were given to Israel are for eternity. They're to take us through a process of instructing us in the plan of Yahweh. Okay, so each of the feasts is not only an actual event that it's memorializing, but it's also pointing us through the plan of salvation. And we're not going to talk about that tonight. We can talk about that on another show. We go through the feasts. And so my short answer really to the question then is, assuming these things are true, which we can prove at another point, the Passover is for all who believe and follow Yahweh and the Messiah Yeshua. It's a covenantal meal, and it's actually two things. This is where we really should probably start. If we're supposed to do something with this event, we need to really understand the event, and we have to first understand that it's actually two events. Okay, there's actually two events. There is the Passover which is the taking of the lamb and slaughtering it, which is done on the afternoon of the 14th, headed to the 15th. And then there's this thing called the meal, the Passover meal. And so there's actually two things that are different. There's performing the Passover and eating the Passover. Okay, now, the eating of the Passover does not have a specific date connected to it, because it's whenever you finish preparing that meal, preparing the animal that you've slaughtered. By the time you sit down and eat it, it is likely already the 15th. Okay, but it's done in the afternoon of the 14th. Now, a lot of people have then asked the question, well, what about the blood on the doorposts? Well, that was a one-time event. And I'm not just guessing this. We know historically that they never did that again. Now, we don't see any instruction telling them to ever do it again or not to do it, but we don't see any evidence that it was ever done more than once. So while we do see people today getting excited about doing everything that they understand from Scripture, it would be, in my opinion, it would be wrong to go ahead and put blood on the doorposts of your house. It was a one-time event for the death angel passing. The death angel is not likely to pass your house this coming Passover. Actually, has never passed anybody's house since that one time in Egypt, okay? So that piece we can understand has never been done again. It was a one-time event. Now, the second thing is this idea of the lamb. Now, the lamb was something that once there became a temple, that was the instruction was it was only to be done by bringing it to the temple. It would be slaughtered, and then you would take the animal back and you would roast it up, and then you would prepare it for your meal. And so without a temple, we're not doing an offering of a lamb. Now, is it okay to eat lamb at your meal? Absolutely, eat lamb. The instruction says that the meal needs to have basically three things: lamb, bitter herbs, and unleavened bread. And so, yes, have lamb. Don't take it in your backyard. You don't have to grab it on the 10th day. You don't have to hold it till the 14th. You don't have to make sure it's perfect and unblemished, but you can certainly have some lamb with your meal, because we're memorializing and remembering an event. Okay? So certainly it's appropriate to have lamb. Now, the Jewish community puts a shank bone on a plate as a symbol of the lamb, but they don't actually eat lamb, because they're actually memorializing the fact that there's no temple. Okay? And so they're not doing that. And so to really answer the question, yes, it's perfectly appropriate, not only appropriate, but required to whatever degree we can actually keep it, to at least make the effort to walk through these feasts. Now, remember, to really keep them, so I don't want to be a hypocrite here, to really keep them, we would be going to Jerusalem, we would be having a temple, there would be offerings and sacrifices. So, yes, I realize we can't in fullness keep the feasts. But what we can do is continue the tradition that we've seen from the first century going till now of memorializing these events by observing them to the fullest of our ability.
Is part of the instruction too is the command to actually teach the children about the coming out, about how Yahweh saved his people. That's part of the actual. Is that part of the actual instruction to teach them during the Passover or during the meal?
Yeah, I don't have the verse in front of me, but yes, there is a verse that says, and you shall, when your child asks, why do you do these things? You're to say, because this is what Yahweh did for me when I came out of Egypt. Now, of course, this is only going to be true for that first generation who came out of Egypt. But it's the idea of saying, had he not brought our forefathers out of Egypt, we would still be slaves in Egypt. Okay, so yes, this goes back to what I explained earlier, which is the memorializing of these events is because the events not only show us the physical event that happened, but we then have the opportunity to learn for ourselves, remind ourselves, as well as instruct our children on the plan of salvation. Because the plan of salvation, the process of how Yahweh planned to go from where we are to a kingdom of people that he's going to live with forever is laid out through the feasts. And so Passover is the first event of the feasts. Actually, if you look at Leviticus 23, Sabbath is the first event of the feast. But we're looking forward to, when you talk about the salvation process, it starts with Passover, with the idea of redemption, coming out. And wait, hold on. Let me grab a verse for us real quick here. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, here. Okay, so I just want to read. This is out of Exodus chapter, let's see, I think it's Exodus 6. No, let me see. I'll get it real quickly here. And Exodus 6 and in verse 6. Okay, in Exodus 6 and in verse 6, what we see happening here in Exodus 6:6 is he explains the process. He says, therefore say to the children of Israel, I am Yahweh, and I shall bring you out. So this is the beginning of the process. He's going to bring them out from under the burdens. And I think this is a life application for us today, too. We are very burdened people. He's going to bring us out from under our burdens. Okay, in this case, he mentions that the burdens of the Egyptians or the Mitzrites. He says, and I shall deliver you from their enslaving, and shall redeem you with an outstretched arm with great judgments, and shall take you as my people, and I shall be your Elohim. Now, so this is the 4 steps. He says, I'm going to bring you out, I'm going to deliver you, I'm going to redeem you, and I'm going to take you as my people. I'm going to accept you as my people. And that's the process that begins with the Passover, and with the story of the coming out of Egypt is a metaphor for our whole life's journey. And so when we rehearse this every year, not only do we experience it for ourselves, remind ourselves, but absolutely we should be explaining these things to our children.
Yeah, totally. I know I enjoy getting to talk with my kids about it. And, my parents wasn't that way. But I'm so thankful that the Father has come into my life and I'm able to talk with him about it, because it's a very powerful message to what Messiah does for us. I did want to ask you, I think it was interesting. I think I heard it on last week's teaching. The blood on the doorpost, what Hebrew letter is that?
Okay, so there's a lot of speculation as to, well, why did they have to put it on the doorposts? If you look at doorposts and the lintel, as you look at that, it would actually make the letter chet. Okay, and a chet is the first letter of the word chai, or life. So they were painting life on their doorpost and on their lintel. It's also been speculated, and there has been some historical research to show, I think it was Rico Cortez was telling me when we were talking about this one time, that he had gone to a museum where they had some ancient Egyptian doorpost, like frames, to go into a building from houses, and there were pagan deities imagery all around the doorpost and the lintel. And he had asked the curator there, or the guide through the tour, is this normal? Did they normally have this stuff on their doorposts and the lintel? And they said, yeah, this is very common. So think about painting blood over these pagan symbols that would have been all over the door, and painting life over that. And also, they were, in a very public way, making a mockery and putting themselves basically at risk. I mean, if you had defamed or defiled or defaced, I don't know what the right word is, probably defacing, these images, that probably could have gotten them killed. And so here, this was a very public declaration that we're all in. Kind of like the Vikings would burn their ships when they would go someplace, so there was no going back. This was a no turning back event. Okay, when the Israelites put blood on the doorposts and they covered up the symbolisms, this was a, we're not turning back. We're all in. And so that's a very, very good question.
Yeah, that is really cool. I didn't know nothing about the pagan symbolism across the lintels and everything. That's really cool. Now it says to eat with haste and have your loins girded and all this. I know there's some question whether that was all in the same day, or it goes over to a second day, because they had to go out. They were commanded to go out and ask of the Egyptians for the gold and silver and other items for them to carry. So I was just wondering, what's your take on that, with the whole day or 2-day event?
Okay. I come from a very brief period of time in Worldwide Church of God, United Church of God. They keep an extra day between the two events. I don't see that scripturally. They were girded and with their staff in hand because they were leaving. When Moses goes to Pharaoh, Pharaoh says, get out, leave, get them out of here. Now, I know people talk about getting the silver and the gold from the Egyptians. Let's understand, this isn't like modern days. The Egyptians didn't have to go to their safety deposit box to get the silver and gold out, or going to the vault in their basement or something. These are not very big buildings, and it wasn't very hard to find where they kept their silver and the gold. And so to go and ask wasn't like an all-day event. This wasn't going to take very long, all right? And so we also have in Numbers chapter 33, where it talks about, I think it's in verse 1, it says, these are the departures of the children of Israel who went out of the land of Mitzrayim by the divisions. And it says in verse 3, so they departed in the first of the month, on the 15th day of the first of the month, on the morrow of the Passover, the children of Israel went. Now when it says the morrow of the Passover, we're talking about the Passover is the thing that they performed, which is on the 14th. And so it was the next morning or the next day that they left on the 15th. And that's an important, very simple thing. They ate the meal. The angel came overnight. All that stuff was going on. And while the Egyptians were burying their dead, the Israelites went and got the silver and gold and headed out, which also gave them a lot easier time getting all of them out of there while the Egyptians were busy burying their dead and all of the other stuff that was going on in terms of them being distraught and emotionally. I mean, imagine just all the firstborns being dead. This was just an incredibly traumatic event, and it would have made it a lot easier for the Israelites to just go ahead and leave while they were dealing with all of that. And so it's my guess and my understanding. When I say guess, I mean, my best piecing the puzzle together is that they left in the morning, that the Passover meal is actually at the beginning of the 15th as you are sitting down with your girded loins. Now, of course, we don't have to gird our loins and have our staff in hand now because we're not leaving, going anywhere. But when we're having that meal is, that's why you have to have unleavened bread at that meal. It says that in the instructions that you would have unleavened bread at that meal because it's already the days of unleavened bread. It begins the days of unleavened bread, that meal. And so I believe that they left that next day. There was no day in between.
Yeah, it's definitely not like they were wheelbarrowing out, tons of gold. I mean, it was probably just a bunch of trinkets and things that were, small and personal. Since you brought up unleavened bread, the command for getting the leaven out of our house, what does that look like for us nowadays? Because I know, culturally, that's a little bit different thing going on back then versus what's happening now because of how they made the next set of, next bunch of bread from the leaven and a little pinch and all that. So could you explain that a little bit? Like for us to clean our house at 11, what does that look like? Should we be, going over itemizing everything that we have in there that would have anything that has to do with leaven or in any baking products or anything?
That's a very good question. We have today, the need with all of the things we study in Scripture is context. And part of the context is that we have to make the effort to understand what it was that they were doing in that time before we could understand how to apply it in our time. Now, part of the context is that when you're reading the verses, and I'm looking down at my notes here, so if you see me looking down, these are my notes. And by the way, there's a teaching that I did that answers all of these questions, at least my answers to these questions. It's called Passover Q&A for questions and answers. It's 2 parts. And in the first part, I deal with the Old Testament. And in the second part, I deal with the issues with coming around the Last Supper and whether it was a Passover or not, those kind of questions. So it's a free teaching. Everything we ever do is free. It's online on our website, on YouTube, whatever. So please feel encouraged to go look at that and listen to that for more details on what I'm sharing. I'm not sharing anything today that's not already on that teaching. Now, so the first thing we need to understand is that there's 2 different words translated leaven. Now, it's just like we know there's more than one word translated love in the Greek. We know there's more than one word for hell translated in the Greek. We know there's more than one word for a lot of things in English and in Hebrew and in Greek and other languages. Well, in this case, the translators have chosen to take the same 2 words, which are completely different, and translate them as leaven. Okay, so now let's understand what these 2 words are. One is seor, seor, and the other is chametz. Okay, so seor is actually the leavening agent. It's the thing that leavens the bread. And chametz is something that has already been made with leavening. It's the leavened end product, like bread, cookies, pastries, whatever, something made that is already leavened. Okay, so we have instructions about the chametz, and we also have the instructions about the siur. Okay, now, so when we're looking at this, they're told that they are to get the chametz out. The chametz has to be removed out of the house. So that all things that are already leavened need to get out of the house, as well as the leavening agent. Now, the leavening agent, as you pointed out, in that time, the leavening agent was a little piece of bread, a starter bread, like you make sourdough bread today, that was already leavened. It was already, something that had been cooked, and then they would use that to then put a piece of it in the dough, and it would then leaven the whole dough to make the next loaf. And so they always kept in a jar this starter piece. And so what they were being told to do was get that starter piece even out of the house, not just that which is already cooked, because we wouldn't want you to be tempted to make leavened bread. Now realize that they didn't have jars of yeast or boxes of yeast. They didn't have, people say, well, what about beer? Beer's got leavening in it. Well, it's not the days of unleavened beer, okay? It's not what it says in the scripture. It's about leavened or unleavened bread. Bread is the metaphor. Okay, now, by the way, when you have alcohol, the yeast is almost completely used up in the alcohol process and it becoming alcoholic. So we don't have any real leavening in there. But it's about getting the starter bread out. So do I feel that the instruction requires you to get all of the yeast and all those other things out of your house? No, I do not. Would it be wrong for you to get it out of the house? Of course not. Remember, one of the things that I always try to communicate is that I want you to be a maximalist and not a minimalist. I want you to do as much as you can, not as little as you can. So if you want to take everything out of your house that even remotely can be connected to yeast, that's all well and good. But realize that the instruction in the Hebrew and in Moses' day was to get out this little starter piece so that you wouldn't use it in the dough to make unleavened bread, to make it leavened. And the reason I say all of this is because you can't really get all the leavening out of your house. There's leavening in the air. It's everywhere. And so if you leave dough out, it will leaven over time. The reason they use the starter piece is because it's a lot quicker to stick that little lump in. That's why we have the idea of a little leaven leavens the whole lump, because it was talking about taking a piece of leaven and putting it into the bread, and then it would leaven the whole thing. And so, when we're looking at things today, I would make sure to get all of the products out of your house that actually are leavened already. The cookies and the breads and the pastries and whatever else you have that's got leavening in it. That's already grown, a finished product. Okay. And by the way, I don't believe that includes, okay, now let's be careful with it. I don't think that includes pasta. I don't think that includes most cereals. Okay. There's nothing less leavened and more flat than like a cornflake. Okay. Okay. So it's not about that. Now, what the Jews have done, okay, and I believe me, I love a lot of their traditions. I come from the Jewish background and from the Jewish traditions. The Jews have decided you can't eat anything from grains except that which is limited to what they call matzah or matzah meal with the wheat, etc. That's their fences around the fences, etc. The verses are talking about get the bread, specifically bread. We can look at things that'll look like bread. Cookies are like bread, cake is like bread. So we'll get the bread out of the house because it's the days of unleavened bread. And it says no leavened bread shall be found in your house. And I want you to get the little starter piece out. So let's make sure at the very least, at the very minimum, I know I told you that I want us to be maximalist, so do as much as you feel that you need to do. But at the very minimum, let's get the bread out of the house. Okay? And if you guys make sourdough bread, some of you may do that. Take the starter piece, get that out of the house. Does that answer the question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I definitely think so. Because I've always wondered about that, because obviously when you first come into this, you're searching through, trying to figure out what has that in it or what could cause leavening. Do we get the pasta out? So I think that clarifies it for a lot of people. I know it does for me. But on the subject of getting the leavening out, can we go ahead and touch on the spiritual part of that as far as how we're supposed to deal with the sin part in our life when this is, because this is a very big event for Israel. This is and ultimately, with Yeshua and what he's done, what does that look like? You know, how focused are we to be on that in this time of unleavened bread during this feast? I mean, should we be every day, day in and day out, trying to, you know, get with the Father and figure out what's going on in our life, you know, to reveal the leavening that's in us? I mean, obviously, I think that's a very big part of this, right?
It is. And I'm just putting up some verses here to reference for the question. Okay, so let's go back just for a second before we jump forward, which is, if you're new at all of this, and even if you're not so new, but you really hadn't thought this through, I don't want you to spend so much effort on the smaller details, then make sure you at least get the big stuff first. That doesn't mean you can't get into the details later. So let's start off with getting bread out of your house that's leavened, and by the way, the other half of that instruction is that you are to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. So each day, eat a piece or some unleavened bread, because it's not only an instruction to not have leavening in your house, but there's actually an instruction that for 7 days you're going to eat unleavened bread. So you do need to eat some unleavened bread. If you've got bread issues, they've got gluten-free matzah that you can get. There's lots of ways that you can make tortillas that are unleavened. There's all kinds of things you can do to get some unleavened bread into you. So you can have unleavened bread. Now we take that forward, again, looking at the bigger picture. It's about what does the leaven represent? Okay, what does the leaven represent? It represents, and this may be a different thing for some of you, it doesn't represent sin. Now, I know you were taught that by everybody that's ever taught, but I'm going to tell you from Scripture, it's not sin. Now, it will absolutely lead to sin. It is the root cause of sin, but it's not sin. Leaven is not sin. He's not asking you to get all the leaven out of your house because he wants you to get all the sin out of your life. But if you get the leavening out of your life, then you will not likely sin. And so one of the main root causes of sin is what leaven really is. So let's look at in Matthew chapter 16. Let me just see where I want to see the verse. Okay, in chapter 16 and verse 5, and his tall ones came to the other side and had forgotten to take the bread. And Yeshua said to them, mind and beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, because we brought no bread. But Yeshua answering, aware of this, said to them, oh, you of little belief, why do you reason among yourselves because you brought no bread? Do you still not understand and neither remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000 and how many baskets you picked up? Or the 7 loaves and the 4,000 and how many large baskets you picked up? How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he did not say to beware the leaven of bread, but the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then we can go to Luke chapter 12 to kind of tie this together. And in verse 1, it says, meanwhile, when an innumerable crowd of people had gathered together so that they trampled one another, he began to say to his taught ones, first, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So it's not just to be aware of anything that the Pharisees and Sadducees taught. He's saying, look, there's problems with what they teach because at times it is laced with and inspired by and just filled with hypocrisy. And so that's, mostly why we sin. Because you see, if you are in the world and you sin, there's no hypocrisy. You're in the world. But if you're going to claim to be covenanted, if you're going to claim to be a child of the living Elohim, you're going to claim to be part of Israel, and that, by the way, the covenant, let's just be simple with this, is Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6. He says, he says to Moses, if the people agree to just do everything I say, I will agree to take them as my people. So the covenant is very simple. We agree to do everything he says. So if you're going to claim to be covenanted, to do everything he says, it's hypocrisy that you spin doing what you want that doesn't necessarily line up with what he says, and then try to convince yourself that it's okay with him or that it really is what he said. It's hypocrisy that's going to get you in trouble. Because when you're in the world, you didn't know what sin was. When you're in the world, you did what you did just because you did what you did. And if you didn't do certain things, it's because society frowned on it, not because you thought it was sin. And so the hypocrisy is the key. So we are to examine ourselves, and this gets back kind of to what you were asking, Danny. We need to examine ourselves leading into the feast. There are times in the verses where Paul says things like, examine yourself prior to the feast. And of course, we should do that prior to all the feasts. And by examining yourself, you should be examining not only is there leaven in there, but what kind of growth have you been experiencing? Are you more Yeshua-like this time you're examining yourself than the last time you examined yourself? Is there growth? What kind of fruit are you bearing? Is there hypocrisy still that needs to be taken out? And so this metaphor is what I think we should be focusing more effort on. It shouldn't take a lot of effort to get the bread out of your house. And by the way, in getting the bread out of your house, it doesn't mean that you need to dismantle your toaster, just empty it. It doesn't mean that you need to throw it out and get a new one. I knew people that did that every year. They use it as an excuse to get rid of it because, oh, there might be a speck of bread somewhere in there. It's not about the speck of bread, okay? Clean out your couch, vacuum your house, do a reasonable job of searching and cleaning up. Yes, you should look for it and search and clean up. But if you spend more time on that, meaning trying to make sure you've gotten every speck of dust than you are in examining yourself and getting the hypocrisy out, then that action in itself is hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy for you to be so focused on that and not caring about the other. This is essentially what Yeshua was saying about, you tithe on these little leaves of the herbs, the mint and the anise, right? And this little stuff that you're tithing on. So that's good, by the way. He said there's nothing wrong with that. But you miss the other bigger stuff. Okay, the compassion, etc. So are you doing that? That's where hypocrisy comes in. Big stuff first, little stuff later. Big stuff means at least get the bread out of your house. If you get good at that, then look for the crumbs too. I don't want you to think that's not an important thing, but let's make sure we're doing the big stuff first and work our way to the small stuff. But if you're going to focus on one narrow piece of it and you get all tunnel vision and you miss the bigger picture, which always is the heart, the mechanics is the metaphor for the bigger picture. Okay? Just like we're told that the feasts are a shadow of things to come. That doesn't mean they're no good. It means that they're only a small reflection of the real. And so they are to point you towards what's real. If you see my shadow, it may look a little like me in form. You might see the shape or the outline of my body in the shadow, but you don't see the details of the eyes and the features, etc., like you see in the real person. The shadow is to get you to think about, oh, look, there's a shadow. That means there's a person there. And so now you want to go and find out maybe what that person's all about. The feasts are like, oh, the feasts are here. What are the feasts all about? And so Passover is the first of them.
Yeah, I like that explanation because, we spend a lot of time, and I know for me personally, and when I say these things, I'm usually referring to myself personally, that trying to do the mechanics part without, fully recognizing what needs to happen, on the heart part. So I greatly appreciate that explanation on that for sure.
Okay, actually, I have a question from somebody in the comments that wanted to know, why didn't the Israelites keep the Passover in the wilderness? And they said they're referencing this from Joshua 5.
Okay, so one of the things that I think all teachers should disclose is that we don't know everything. And there are things that are in the scriptures that probably nobody knows or understands. And so I don't think that there is a clear explanation that we could just point to as to why they did or didn't do certain things while they were in the wilderness. There's also a lack of circumcision going on while they were in the wilderness, which we see them doing right before they crossed the Jordan. Which actually is connected to the Passover, so there's probably part of that as well. They did do the first Passover, and then a month later the second Passover, because there was an explanation for that. I don't think it was until after they had been punished, where they were told, now you're not getting to go in the land, that they stopped keeping the Passover. And so there's some connection to that in that understanding, because there is clear instruction about a first Passover and a second Passover. If for whatever reason you were not clean, and that like you had come across a dead body or you've done something that would have made you tameh, which is a whole other thing we could talk about, what tameh is and tahor. Tameh is unclean, tahor is clean. So we do know there's instructions about a second Passover, and we see them keeping it. Okay, so at some point they stop, and when they stop, I think it is connected to when they refuse to go into the land. And then from that point until they cross into the land, they were not keeping these things till they went into the land. As a matter of fact, when you look at Leviticus 23, the instruction for Shavuot starts off with, and when you come into the land, you're going to do Shavuot. They didn't do Shavuot in the wilderness. And so there's a connection to these are things to be done as a corporate body in the land. Why they didn't do it in the wilderness, I don't have a real good answer for you.
Okay. I think that was good enough of an answer for them, though.
Okay, good.
All right. Well, while you're on the subject, can we get into the unclean and the clean part and what that looks like for us, partaking in the dinner itself? What does that look like? How are we to be, to enter into that? Because there's certain instructions throughout the scripture that describe what we should look like, before we enter into that meal.
Okay, so, and by the way, just so you understand, let me just read you a quote out of John, which is actually part of the explanation as to how I know the Last Supper was not a Passover. But let's look in John. I think it's in John.
That's good, because I have that as my question, because I wanted to try to get through some of the Old Testament things with the Passover, and then we can get into Yeshua and some of the things in the New Testament. But that was one of my questions, so we can hit that in a little bit.
Okay, give me 1 second to just tell you where this is in John. 1 second. Okay, so in John 18. And in verse 28, then they led Yeshua from Caiaphas to the palace, and it was early. This is as they have already captured him, and they're taking him to back and forth between the Sanhedrin and Pilate, and also they're just going back and forth. And they brought him to the palace lest they should be defiled. Okay, so it says, and they themselves did not go into the palace lest they should be defiled or made tameh, but that they might eat the Passover. And so Pilate therefore came out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? So there was this understanding, so it's sort of a precursor to answering your question, that certain things they believed would make you unclean, and then you couldn't take the Passover, you'd have to wait the next month. And you didn't want to have to do all that because, after all, everybody was together. You wanted to be a part of it when everybody was together. You didn't want to be one of the few people doing it the next month. And so here, the people that are bringing from Caiaphas, from the high priest, they're bringing Yeshua to Pilate, didn't want to enter the palace because they believed entering the palace would make them unclean. Now, whether it did or not is another story. I mean, that could be highly debated as to what really makes you unclean and what makes you clean. And I know that was more part of your question. We'll talk about that in a second. But they believed it would make them unclean and they wouldn't be able to eat the Passover. So they hadn't eaten it yet. Okay? They hadn't eaten it yet. And by the way, before, in case we don't get to it, and maybe till later, because I know we don't want to have this go like 5 hours here, but just a real simple answer to the Passover Last Supper question. Okay, very simple. This is not going to take a degree in rocket science or any kind of thing like that. Generally speaking, do you normally eat the animal before or after you kill it? Okay. I mean, I generally like them to have been killed already before I eat them. Okay? And so if we all agree that Yeshua died when they slaughtered the lambs, which is actually what the word says. It says he died when they were slaughtering the lambs. What lambs? The lambs for Passover. So how could he die and eat the meal the night before and be eating the Passover? Oh, but the word says that he's our Passover lamb. Well, yes, the metaphor of what the Passover lamb was for,
the salvation part, the life,
and the idea that he died when they killed the lambs, all is consistent, but yet has nothing to do with him eating the meal the night before. You don't eat the meal and then kill the animal the next day. Okay, so it's not real complicated. Plus, we have this verse in John that helps as well. They hadn't eaten the meal yet either. It was the day before. Now, as far as what I know this is kind of getting away from our question, but just to make sure we hit this, they were likely doing one of two things that night. It was very common for teachers when they were graduating their students to have a graduation meal. First of all, let's kind of go back into the first century. Yeshua was not the only teacher running around with disciples. It was very common. They didn't have schools for people to be going to, okay? If you wanted to study with somebody, you would become their student or disciple, and you would travel around with them. So generally, there was a bunch of people out there with a half a dozen to 2 dozen or whatever it was, students that they were training, and they would do that for, you know, a year, 2 or 3 years, whatever it was. Then they would graduate them out and get a bunch of new ones. And so Yeshua knew his time was done with these students. So this could have been a graduation supper. It also could have been a tradition with Galilean Jews, which they were almost all Galilean Jews, was to do what's called the fast of the firstborn. Now let's understand that the only people at risk on the original Passover, back in Exodus chapter 12, the only people at risk were the firstborns. Everybody else was fine. Nobody else was going to die. Nobody else was at any danger. And so by tradition, the Galilean Jews, the firstborns, would have a big meal the day before the Passover, the evening before, and then they would fast until the Passover meal as a symbol of realizing and appreciating that if it wasn't for the intervention of the Almighty to tell them to put the blood and the protection that he gave them, they could have been killed as well. So it's a very important moment for firstborns to realize that this was about firstborns. And so that is a very likely answer to what they were actually doing. Now, I know there are verses where he says, I wish, with great desire, I wish to take this Passover with you. Yeah, he did. Same thing like when he said, Abba, if it's possible, take this cup from me. He wanted to take this Passover with them.
Yeah, but
he just wasn't going to be able to.
I was going to say, but that don't necessarily mean it was that night. He could have just been referring, I wish, tomorrow or whatever, I could do the, partake with the Passover with you, but obviously I won't be able to.
I won't be able to. And that's when he says, look, I'm not going to drink of this cup again until I do it with you in the kingdom. So let's kind of keep those things lined up. Okay. I know it's hard. We've been well indoctrinated. We've been well churched. We've been call it whatever you want. We've been taught and instructed for so long that we start to wonder when we read the scriptures of the story of the Exodus and it doesn't match what Cecil B. DeMille put on in the 10 Commandments, we start to think the scripture's wrong. Because after all, you saw the movie 47 times. And so it must be the way it was in the movie. And then when certain things happen in the movie that don't happen in the scriptures, you think the scripture's wrong. And so let's get to the place where we're able to accept what it says is what it says, not what you've been told it says is what it says. Okay, what it says is what it says, regardless of what you've been told your whole life. And it doesn't matter if that matches what you've been told. It doesn't matter if it completely inside out and upside down from what you've been told. It is what it is. And we have to stop fighting and arguing with what it is, because it is what it is. And so the best case argument is he died to be the perfect lamb at the same time that they killed the lambs. And so therefore, nobody had eaten the meal yet. They were not going to eat it until after those lambs were then taken and roasted and then cooked to full and then eaten that night. And so so that's the important thing. Plus, we know that he was taken down because the holy day was going to start the next day. He was taken down. Now, of course, that's why people try to use that to fit in the day between thing. But the day between thing is them trying to force the Last Supper into a Passover. That's what they're trying to force. They've been told so many times that it was a Passover meal. Actually, it's amazing, but that's one of the few things I like about the translations of the New Testament over the centuries, is they called it the Last Supper. They didn't call it the Passover. It's one of those few added things that Christianity, I know, got right. It was his Last Supper. And so they didn't call it Passover. They didn't say it was the Passover meal. And so I think that's important. Now, as far as this Tamei Tahor thing, today, a lot of focus is on, how do I want to explain this? We're not the kind of community that would be first century would have had. We're not the kind of community that would have been in Moses' day and a lot of that in between, where people lived together in a community. They knew each other. There was authority that was submitted to, and that authority could make decisions. And we don't have that really today. We're much more scattered. We don't really respect authority. So we don't really have authority that can say this or that and rule on things in a community sense. And so we have some things that are not really as doable in the way it would have been done. Okay, now, we didn't talk about this, but I know we need to talk about this. Now, who can take of the Passover? Who can eat the Passover meal? What state? That's kind of the question you were kind of getting to. And so circumcision becomes a big question, as well as all the other issues that could disqualify you from eating the meal. Now, if there was a corporate community body, everybody would know each other. Everybody would know who's covenanted. Everybody would know who's circumcised. Everybody would know who's made the commitments. Everybody would know who's accepted basically Yeshua as Mashiach. Everybody would know these things. And the leadership would be able to say to somebody, I know that you're not in the right place to be at this meal. For whatever reason, and we'll talk about some reasons here in a minute, but we don't have that today. Okay? We don't have a structure where, when I say everybody would know, for example, that you're circumcised, not because you're going to have to drop your drawers and prove it, but they would know that you had the Brit Milah done, the circumcision done when you were 8 days. The community would have done things as a community. And so they would all know that you had these things done. And so modern days, we have people that are coming from all kinds of places with all kinds of backgrounds. A lot of us grew up in the 60s and 70s when circumcision was done in the hospital when you were born, regardless of whether you wanted it or not. They just did it automatically. So you got an awful lot of people out there that are circumcised and it had nothing to do with the Torah. I mean, I was circumcised on the 8th day, but, you know, as a matter of fact, this might be neat. Give me 1 second. I'm going to get something to show you. I'm going to show you something. Give me 1 second.
Hey, Trey, you doing all right there, buddy?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. Just listening.
Yeah.
I guess we're both just sitting here chilling with over 60 people watching.
That's all right. Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying it.
I know I am.
Oh, yeah. You know, and I've already learned quite a bit, especially the.
Yeah, I'm just looking for something I want to show you. I think it's right here. Okay, this is, I don't know if you'll be able to read this because I don't know how much the camera reverses anything. When I find it, I'm going to show you something that I have in my paper. So here it is. Okay, we're going to pull this out. So this is something that my mother gave me after I moved out and as an adult. I don't know if maybe you can see that. Look at that. Okay.
Wow.
That is my, now it's backwards, I know, but that is my Brit certificate. Okay, that shows it was done on the 8th day.
Wow.
Okay. And so, because I was born on the 18th, it says it was done on the 26th. And I mean, excuse me, the 25th, which is 8 days. Okay, and so I actually have this from when, you know, they give them to, as a Jew, the rabbi will give this to your parents as a certificate that you are actually, you know, everything was done according to the Torah. But so I actually have a certificate that shows that. But let's kind of talk about these issues. The thing is that because people are coming from so many places and we would not know, what are we going to do? And I hate to be blunt, what do we have, a pecker checker at the door? I mean, you can't do that. Okay, I mean, I'm not trying to be vulgar, but let's just be honest. And, you know, as funny as that may be. So,
well, I don't think nobody wants that job anyway.
Nobody wants that job. And every time I teach, I say, look, the reason we don't do that is because nobody wants the job. I mean, who would want that job? But also, it would not be that useful because just because someone is circumcised doesn't mean that they did it to covenant. They could have had it done in the hospital like millions of people did, you know, in the 60s and 70s as just automatic. All right. And so it doesn't mean anything in itself anymore that it would have meant back then, where nobody would have done it except for this reason. Okay, this is the only reason anybody would have done it back then. Now, for health reasons and other reasons, I know we could start a big firestorm of argument about whether it's healthy, whether it's torture, whether it's this or that, and let's not get into that right this second. Let's just understand that the book talks about circumcision, whatever that means, and it does say that it's a requirement for the Passover. Now, and that's in Exodus 12. Now, of course, I know a lot of people are going to be screaming that circumcision is now of the heart. Well, it was always both, and I don't have the verses in front of me, but I can show you in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and other places where it says that you were supposed to circumcise the foreskin of your heart. You were always supposed to have both. But in Exodus 12, and we can go through Exodus 12 here just real quickly, and then we'll kind of talk about how we might handle that today. Let me just find my notes on that so I can kind of follow with my notes. Okay, but in Exodus chapter 12, we have some interesting things here. And again, look, I know, I'm going to be honest with you. I'll say I don't know. I mean, I can intellectually understand how hard it must be if you're not circumcised and you're an adult and you read the verses and you're going to sit there going, that doesn't sound like something I want to do. And the reason I say I kind of know is because it was done to me at 8 days. I didn't have a choice and I don't remember it. Now, when I say I kind of know, is because I also know a lot of people that have done this as adults, and every one of them has survived it without any problem, okay? But I can imagine that the thought of doing this, if I had to do this at my age or as an adult, would not be very appealing. And I can understand that. But again, are we going to listen to the word, what it says, or we're not? Now, in Exodus 12, it says, and starting in verse 43, it says, Yahweh said to Moshe and Aaron, this is the law of the Passover. No son of a stranger is to eat of it, but any servant of a man who has been bought with silver, when you have circumcised him, then let him eat of it. A sojourner and a hired servant does not eat of it. It is eaten in one house. You are not to take any flesh outside the house, nor are you to break any bone of it. And all the congregation of Israel are to perform it. And by the way, a lot of you must, I'm sure, know that that's part of why Yeshua didn't have any broken bones, and it was supposed to be a perfect lamb without blemish, without broken bones. So there's a lot of connections here to why Yeshua didn't have any broken bones, because normally they would have broken his legs if he wasn't dead yet to help speed up the process. That's what they do with people that are crucified. Instead, they stabbed him when they didn't break any bones, right? Verse 47, it says, all the congregation of Israel are to perform it. And when a sojourner sojourns with you and shall perform the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and let him come near and perform it. And he shall be as a native of the land, but let no uncircumcised eat of it. Okay, so now remember, we have perform, and then all of a sudden now we have eat. So now that shows it includes the meal as well as the slaughtering of the animal and the other issues regarding the Passover lamb. Performing it was the killing of the lamb. The eating of it was the meal afterwards. And it says here, no uncircumcised is to eat of it. Verse 49, there's one Torah for the native born and for the stranger who sojourns among you. Now, it's very important that we understand the different words being used here in the Hebrew. Because it says sojourner, it says stranger, it says it 3 or 4 different times. Are they the same word? And the answer is not always. No, they're not the same word. Verse 43, it says, no son of a stranger is to eat of it. The word there is nechar. Nechar is an alienated person. The term refers to 2 kinds of people. One, an Israelite who has become apostate. In other words, one who worships idols, desecrates the Sabbath, or denies the validity of any of the Torah commands. So this could be an Israelite who has now become technically uncircumcised. Okay, this is what Paul's talking about, that a circumcised person who acts like an uncircumcised person, doesn't that invalidate the circumcision? The answer is yes. This is what it's talking about here. It also could be talking about a non-Israelite who may be traveling through Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. So this is somebody who's a stranger traveling and passing through. Okay, so this nechar is either an Israelite who has no longer covenanted, or it's talking about a non-Israelite who's passing through. Then there's the toshav. In verse 45, it says a sojourner and a hired servant does not eat of it. So the sojourner in verse 45 is what's called a toshav. A toshav is a non-Israelite who actually lives in the land. I mean, look, I lived in a neighborhood where I had Korean people in my neighborhood, I had Haitian people in my neighborhood, I had Italian people in my neighborhood, I had Indian people in my neighborhood, I had the UN in my neighborhood. Okay, so we were all a mix of different people. So what he's saying is, look, in the land of Israel, when you're in the land as a nation, you may have people from other lands living in the land, but they're not part of the nation. But they're living there like a resident alien. Okay, a resident alien. Okay, so that's verse 45. A resident alien doesn't get to partake. And then we have this thing in verse 48 called the ger. Okay, and when a stranger sojourns with you, the stranger there is the ger. The ger is a proselyte. In other words, it's one who is converting, changing citizenship to be an Israelite. In other words, they're studying and they're interested and they're pretty sure this is what they want to do, but they haven't committed to it yet. So they're like a disciple. They're studying. It's kind of like Acts 15. In Acts 15, Yaakov said to them, look, stop harassing the Gentiles, that they have to go ahead and get circumcised just so they can attend. And I'm not talking about Passover. I'm talking about attend anything. They didn't want, Gentiles to come and learn anything until they got circumcised. He says, no. Let them learn. And when they decide that they want to commit and covenant and join, then they need to circumcise. Okay? So the proselyte is required in verse 48. It says, if the sojourner, the proselyte who's sojourning with you, wants to perform the Passover, then let all of his males be circumcised, and then he can come near and perform it. You know why? Because in verse 49, there's one Torah for the native born and the ger. That word sojourner, there's again the ger. Not the toshav, not the nechar. This is for the ger. Okay, so all of us start off as ger unless you were native born. I was native born. But most of the people that I meet within the Messianic Hebrew roots are not native born. Now, of course, they can go and do the DNA swab in their cheek and the whole thing, and they can figure out if they were native born. But most of them, as far as they're concerned, were not native born. They are what they call the ger. And so when the ger decides to covenant, change citizenship, be grafted in, whatever word works for you, they are to be circumcised. And so this was part of the covenanting. And so I know you don't like it. If I were you, I probably wouldn't like it. So I'm not trying to be flip. I'm not trying to, it's what's there to like about having to go take your most private of parts and have a knife put to it? I mean, there's nothing, desirous about that. So sure, I can understand trying to find every possible reason why you don't have to do it. But I can't get around what it says. Okay, I can't get around that. Now, in my position, I've had to make decisions on behalf of the people that I've been given to shepherd. So here are some of the decisions I've made. Whether you agree with them or not is great. That's up to you. Listen to whoever your shepherd is. But when people have asked me, what comes up occasionally is, well, what about, I've had men call me in their 70s and 80s or even a little bit younger who have health issues that are serious enough where it would actually be not the safest thing to even have a minor surgery like circumcision. They would have to come off their blood thinners, which could end up with a clogging of the arteries and a heart attack or whatever, stroke or something. They would have to, there's issues and problems that make it high risk. And I believe, and this is my call, and by the way, Deuteronomy tells us, and other places in the New Testament tell us that the teacher has a double judgment, because if the teacher makes a judgment and you follow it, it's not your fault now, it's the teacher's fault. And so I know this is on me. And having said that, I have made a decision that my best understanding is that if you can't, not won't, if you can't get circumcised, then it's okay, because you can't. The same thing that the Jews have always determined for fasting on Yom Kippur. If you have a health issue which requires you to eat, like diabetes, like certain medications that require food, then you are to eat. You're not breaking the fasting command by eating because you need to, because you have a life-threatening situation if you don't. It's dangerous for you not to eat.
Well, because ultimately, too, life is what the Creator's about. He's not the God of death. So, I can understand that, making that kind of call.
Right. Okay. So that's the call. Now, the second part of the call is this, and I know not everybody loves this call. Some people appreciate it. It's my understanding that the age of majority to make your own decisions is age 20. That's scripture, because in the book of Numbers, when they took the censuses for the army, they counted the men 20 and above. So I know in some countries it's 18, sometimes it's 21, whatever. No, but in the scripture, they were counting the men 20 and above. So I have made the call, and again, right or wrong, that if you are coming into this and you have children, that your male children do not necessarily have to make this decision until they're 20. Now, I do know quite a few men that when they were ready to make the commitment, they took their sons of all ages and they all went and did it. That's great. What I'm saying is, if you want to wait because you want your child to make the choice for himself, because look, it's easy enough when you do it at 8 days because it's a commitment of the parent to raise the child in the Torah. See, when I got circumcised in the 8th day, it was a commitment by the parent to raise me a certain way. When I had my son circumcised on the 8th day, same thing, I was committing as the parent. Now, but what if you were raised with nothing, or you're raised Christian, you're raised Buddhist, you're raised something else other than a Torah observant Israelite? Well, then, now that you're coming into this at whatever age you are, you may have teenagers that are not quite buying into all this. And even if they are, they may not be ready to make the commitment themselves. And so it's been my call that they need not make that decision until 20. Okay? Now, if they want to make it earlier, that's great. But they need not make that decision until 20. I equate this with the baptism idea. I generally do not baptize children until they're 20. I'd like them to be doing something as important as this at an age where they can at least reasonably, possibly understand what they're doing. And quite frankly, I was a 20-year-old once, and I remember how dumb we were and how much we didn't know at age 20. Okay? And so, and I know children today are not any sharper than we were. Okay? That's not insulting them. I just haven't seen a tremendous leap in that progression. Okay? If anything, it's gone backwards with everybody sitting there texting and playing video games and everything else. They're getting socially dysfunctional, and they're not maturing. They're maturing a lot slower even than we did. But at least at 20, we have a scriptural number that we can work with. And so I don't even normally baptize until they're 20. Okay, now I might make an exception here or there. I haven't up to this point, but I mean, I'm certainly open to the possibility. But generally, I've tried to maintain that if you're going to covenant, and baptism's a covenantal event, circumcision's a covenantal event, that you ought to know what you're doing, or if the person's doing it to their child at 8 days, they ought to know what they're doing because they're committing to something. And so if your parent, if your father is circumcised, you are covered by your father until you are 20. That's 1 Steve chapter 4, verse 8 or whatever. I mean, it's not scripture. This is just my interpretation. All right. And so that's how I'm putting this together and understanding. Because remember, circumcision was a big deal. This is what Paul was basically almost hung out to dry on, is that he was accused of teaching against circumcision. And he came to Jerusalem in front of the Jerusalem council to make a case that he was not doing any such thing. Go ahead and do the Nazirite vow to prove it. And he did. So we have to be careful using some of the New Testament verses that Christianity likes to use against circumcision, because Paul, who they use, was not teaching against circumcision. And most of the time when he talks about those of the circumcision, those of the uncircumcision, he's simply talking about the native versus the ger, or the native, in other words, the person born in the fold, and the one who is a Gentile, completely outside. He's giving a distinction based on your how you came about being where you were, not where you were by choice, but just kind of how you came about to be. Some of us were born native, some of us weren't. And by the way, Paul's biggest point was it makes no difference. There's no advantage necessarily to being born a native. Although he does say, what advantage is it to be a Jew? He says, in every way, there's advantages. Well, only if they're actually doing what they're doing, because they don't have to overcome all the confusion of what they were lied about. Now, I'm not saying that the Jews now today, with all the years of Talmud and everything else, haven't had their own bunch of confusion. But when Paul wrote this, okay, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud hadn't been written yet. Okay, so I mean, there was not as much confusion from that point of view. Although there was almost as many denominations of Judaism back then as there's denominations of Christianity today. There was a lot of sects. There was a lot of sects, not sects, but sects of Judaism. And it's not an easy word to say without confusing people. But let's understand that the circumcision thing, I know it's a very visceral thing for people. It's very, it strikes emotion. It's look, I mean, who wants to do that? I mean, why would anybody want to do this? And then you may want to argue, but why would he want to make people do this today? It wasn't my decision. Okay, it wasn't my decision. And so you may want to also argue, well, did they do it differently then than now? Possibly. it's likely that the way we do it today, for sure, at the very least, was what they started doing after the event of the Maccabees. Were they doing it that way before? Arguments have made on both sides and that kind of thing. But, because of what was going on in the Maccabees days, in the Maccabees, the Hellenistic Jews, the Jews that were becoming Hellenized, Greek, wanted to participate in Greek society, and they had these gymnasiums. And a gymnasium was these places where the men would go to do athletics, and they did it in the nude. They weren't wearing anything. This is, very shocking to you. None of you are going to show up at Planet Fitness and go there naked. I know. And thank you don't, because none of us want to see that. And certainly if it's me, I know you don't want to see that. But everybody now has a terrible visual as they're trying to picture us, at Planet Fitness. But the thing is, in the gymnasiums, that's what they did. And the Jews, to maybe not stand out as much, it says that they actually would pull on what was left of the foreskin to get it to kind of stretch and grow, so they looked like they were uncircumcised, and they would not stand out in the gymnasium. So there must have been something that was still left there where that's not the way they do it today. And it's likely that that's where they maybe made the change to doing it the way they do it today. That's a possibility. So therefore, there was nothing to pull on, to stretch, and to mess with. You were circumcised, you were stuck with it for the rest of your life. You couldn't really mess with that. So I don't know. The bottom line is, though, this is not something we can check. This is something we instruct. And then we leave it on the people to deal with it. Let's go now to the other side of this. What if you are circumcised, but you're not keeping the Sabbath? You're not eating kosher. You're acting all worldly and this and that and the other thing. So what's the point? So you're circumcised, big deal. You got the rest of your life as a complete worldly mess. So I should let you in just because you're circumcised? Again, we're not really in a society where I get the option to go ahead and make judgment and say, I'm sorry, but you can't come in. I'd like it to be that way, because that would make more sense. Not because I want that job, just that leaders can make those calls. Because quite frankly, why would you be at a covenantal meal if you're not keeping the Sabbath? As a matter of fact, I know I can check the men. I'm not going to ask them to drop their drawers. I'm going to look at their drawers to see if they got their seat on. If you don't wear seat, why are you coming to this? If you can't at least put seat on, you think you're covenanted? There's a sign of covenant. I've got mine. Okay. All right. All the time. And so, I should be able to look at somebody walking there going, I'm sorry. Like the fancy restaurants with the fancy maitre d' doorman, saying, I'm sorry, you can't come in.
Yeah, I don't make it to those places.
I don't either.
You got to own a lot more pairs of pants than I do.
Look, if they don't put ketchup on the table, I don't want to eat there.
You got that right. That's for sure. So it really, it's going into the part where it's actually talking about, being circumcised of the heart, because obviously these are all heart matters anyway. The physical is the physical in the flesh, but if your heart isn't right and that hasn't been circumcised, then you're not trying to do the covenanted things that the Creator wants us to do anyway.
And that's really where the examining yourself part comes in. You should be examining yourself, and quite frankly, you should be self-editing. We actually have a few people coming this year, to Passover with us. Actually, we've got quite a big group coming who are self-editing. They know they're not circumcised. They know they're not covenanted. Some of them, by the way, it's not because they're not physically circumcised. They know they have not made the commitments to walk this walk out where they feel like they're ready to participate. And by the way, it's only the meal you can't do. You can come to the holy day the next day. You can come to the holy day 7 days later. You can go to Shavuot, trumpets, atonement, Sukkot, Shemini Atzeret at the end, the 8th-day festival. The only thing that's limited to covenanted people only is that meal. And so I know that, but there's pride and there's ego, and people are going to notice that I'm not there. Well, good. Let them notice you're not there and feel terrible about that, so that next year you're there. It's kind of like people don't like the idea that we may put somebody outside the camp. Well, being put outside the camp is supposed to suck, so that you're going to want to be back in the camp, so that you're going to want to make teshuvah and do what you need to do. Yah forbid we should make anybody uncomfortable and actually, make them actually do anything.
Well, the uncomfortable part is what makes you want to reflect on your life and do the teshuvah, right? I mean, that's what being outside the camp is the kind of the embarrassment. And I know people don't like the whole stand the kid in the corner or whatever, but I mean, that's initially what it is. It's like you're being punished because you're not doing what Creator wants us to do.
Exactly. And I'll give you an example. When I first started on this journey, I was 23 years old, and I came to know about Messiah, and I came to know about a thing called the Holy Spirit. And I was told that the Holy Spirit is a helper. And at 23, I certainly could echo that right now, but certainly at 23, I needed all the help I could get, especially because this was so new to me. I mean, I was raised a secular Jew. I didn't know anything about the New Testament, didn't know anything about Messiah. And so here I am believing now in this Messiah, reading the New Testament. And I said, I need a helper. So you know what I did? I asked the pastor, I said, how do you get this? How does this work? I need this help. And you know what? He told me the process that they used to kind of go through what they felt were the hoops you needed to jump through before they would baptize you and lay hands on you, etc. And you know what I did? I did everything I could to do all of that because I wanted that. If you want to be covenanted and you want to be at the meal, then you'll do what you need to do. And that's, but of course, we talk big like, well, I'd lay down my life and I do this and I do that, but you're not going to get circumcised. It's just a flap of skin. Is it really that big a deal? I lived my whole life without it. It hasn't bothered me at all. Okay. I know a lot of people, even in their 60s, have got it done. Doesn't bother them at all. They've never told me, man, that was the worst decision I ever made. I mean, it's just not changed their lives that dramatically. Okay. But it's where are we drawing the line and why are we drawing the line? What is motivating us to not do it? Okay. Because I'll tell you this again, back to the maximalist thing. Doing everything to the best of your ability, even if it turns out to be more than you had to do, is not going to get you in trouble. Not doing it could. That's the key. Why don't we have that mindset? The mindset of doing more is not going to get me in trouble. When we have a verse that says, if you do what is expected of you and just do the minimum, you're going to get told, oh, you're a useless servant. You just did everything you were told. You didn't do more than that. Well, what if we're editing out things that he did say, but may or may not be necessary today? Well, because, maybe you win that argument, and ultimately it turns out you didn't have to get circumcised. I can't imagine how that would be. But let's say that happens. I promise you, everybody that did it is not going to get in trouble. However, if it turns out that you did have to get it done, and you made excuses, and you justified not doing it, you could be in trouble. And that's what I want you to be thinking about. I want you to be thinking about that when you make your decisions. Am I trying to lie to myself or rationalize why I don't have to do something I really don't want to do? See, if you wanted to do it, you'd rationalize why you should do it. I mean, if Yah said that in order to covenant, you need to have chocolate cake, you'd find a reason to go get yourself some chocolate cake.
Yeah, absolutely. That's for sure.
Oh, yeah. But if he said to go and do something that's not comfortable and painful or whatever it's going to be, of course you're going to try to figure out a reason not to do it. Okay? Of course you are. And by the way, this is no different than the person that has to go to their boss in a job they've had for 25 years and say, I need the Sabbath off, knowing full well the boss might tell them, go jump in a lake, you're fired. This is no less uncomfortable than a million things that we have to do if we're in this calling. I mean, he asks us to get uncomfortable. He takes us out of our comfort zone in this diaspora, in this dispersion, in the punishment, basically. I mean, we're in we're in Deuteronomy 28, the second half of the chapter, the punishments, the cursing. It's supposed to suck. It's not supposed to be all joy and fun. We're supposed to have those moments of realizing we're in a punishment. It may be for those of us who live in, like the US and Canada and some of these sort of nicer, facilitated countries. We've got indoor plumbing and we've got all this wonderful things. So it's the country club punishment. It's still a punishment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think we forget the whole part throughout the scripture where, the whole refining process that goes on. I mean, every time Israel is in a is in a mess, and there's always a bunch of refining that's going on because he's trying to figure out who he wants to be with for eternity. So, you know, I mean, the fact that he let a whole generation die off before they could even go in the land because they didn't want to do what he said. And then now Joshua's out there with the flint knife getting ready to take care of all these people that are, you know, getting ready to enter the land and be in covenant. I mean, there's a lot that we overlook, you know, I think the difficulty parts because, and this is coming from my background, you know, Jesus did everything. Now, he did do a lot. I'm very thankful that Yeshua did what he did. And I'm there's no way I could ever even remotely come close to repaying or doing anything for him other than trying to be obedient to the best of my ability.
Now that you brought Yeshua up, let's bring him up from this point of view. Do we all realize he was circumcised the 8th day? I mean, he was circumcised the 8th day. As a matter of fact, there's a verse that talks about him being there. And that's when there was one that said, oh, I got to see, you know, he prophesied about seeing Messiah before he died. He was circumcised the 8th day. So if you are going, don't you not want it? He says, follow me. Well, that means do what I do. He was circumcised. I promise you. As a Jew, he was circumcised. Okay, on the 8th day. And so you see these things happening. Okay, in the tradition, even at bar mitzvah, you see him at 13, and he's in the temple teaching. He was likely bar mitzvahed as well. These are things that were going on at the time. So these are traditions, and some of those things were involved. But the point is that, you know, we can either, and I've been talking about this in the CC 101 class, the Covenant Community 101 class, we have to get to the point where we make a conscious decision to accept Yah as he is and stop trying to mold him into what we want him to be or think he should be or what everybody's always told me he is. You know, what everybody sort of, you know, painted a picture of, you know, he is what he is. He said what he said, and it doesn't matter what everybody else thinks he said or wants it to say. It is what it is. And it doesn't matter that you like it or not. You know, there are some people, for example, I'll give you an example. We had, just to kind of go through what that could be like. Now, please, everybody, don't take this in the wrong way. We did not do anything, like I said earlier, not to do, but we had somebody bring us a lamb one year, and people kill lambs every day. They kill all kinds of animals every day to eat them, okay? So they brought a lamb so we could see what it was like to fall in love with an animal, and then they killed it and cooked it for us, which people do every day. They kill a cow, they kill a chicken, they kill it, they cook it, and etc. But we asked people to go ahead and just eat some of that lamb, just to know what it was like to eat a lamb that they had seen, that they kind of maybe thought was adorable and cute. And by the way, a lot of people couldn't even watch the killing of the lamb. Now, we didn't do this as a ritual. We didn't do it as a sacrifice. There was no ceremony. It was just the normal dressing of an animal, okay? We had the animal, we killed it, and then we cooked it, okay? Something that's done every day. Now, so you're used to just going to the supermarket and it's already in a nice package with, you know, shrink wrap on it. You know, no, we're talking about the people back in the day who had to go out to the flock. Like when Abraham said to his wife, you know, go ahead and make some stuff. And he sent somebody out to go get the lamb and the fatted calf and kill it and then cook it. That's what we did. But I wanted people to see what that might feel like to actually connect with the animal itself. Okay, and picture what Yeshua did. Now, here's the interesting thing. We had some former Adventists. They may have still been a little bit still Adventists who were at this event. And I encouraged everyone just to eat at least one little piece of the lamb, just to know what that whole thing was all about. And you know what? A lot of them did. But here's the thing. I had one lady come up to me, and she was distraught. And what she was distraught about was she could not believe we killed that animal to eat it because she was raised a vegetarian Adventist. And I said to her, I said, look, the scripture talks about Yahweh, your creator, ordering, commanding the slaughter of millions of animals over years and years and years and years and years. And so if you're having a problem with, it's not with me, it's with him. I mean, she was really upset that we would kill an animal and eat it. And there's lots of things in the scripture that makes you go, he told Saul to kill everybody. Now, of course, it's hard to read that chapter, but not to realize that the reason you ended up with Haman in the book of Esther is because Saul didn't kill everybody, because he let Agag live. And so But you sit there going, what kind of God would tell someone to kill everybody, the women, the children, the cattle, everybody, everything. And so we have to go beyond that whole thought process and say, it is what it is, whether I understand it or not. My liking is irrelevant. It is what it is. So you may not like that he told them to kill everybody. You may not like that he said that, to kill animals and use them as sacrifices and that it's okay to eat them. There's a lot of things you may not like. But if you're going to walk this walk, he says, your liking, it's irrelevant. You're agreeing to do what I say and to trust in me. That's the covenant. It's not complicated. I talk, you do. End of story. Why anybody makes it like it's some major contract with tiny writing that you're like a business would do? No, the covenant is very simple. You agree to do everything I say. That's Exodus 19, 5 and 6. He says, Moses, go tell them, if they agree to do what I say, I'll take them as my people. End of story. It's not a complicated covenant. And yet, we watch people every day. If you're in any kind of leadership, if you're doing a show like you guys do, I'm sure you get emails and stuff, who want to argue with the book because they don't like what it says. And then if you don't like what it says, go read a version that changes some of the things you don't like the NIV or something like that, where they take verses out that they don't like, they alter verses that they don't like. Okay, go read a version that does all of that. But we have to stop fighting with it. If you're going to be an Israelite and worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then you're going to have to stop fighting with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I'm sorry, but he said certain things that have to do with the feasts and Passover and all these other things. And yes, circumcision is part of that, but it's part, not all. And yes, I am more concerned with the hypocrisy of the person wanting to come to the dinner, who I never see on Shabbat, who never comes to anything else, but they want to come to dinner because it's a nice big meal. And I love the ones out there who love to do these giant hotel things, and everybody in their town comes, and all the churches all come, and all the Christians all come, and none of them are covenanted. That's wrong. Scripturally, it's just wrong. Now, there is the opportunity. Some of you may be wondering, so what can you do? You know what you do? There's a Baptist church nearby that asked me to do a Passover thing for them. You know what I did? I did it the week before. We didn't do everything, so they didn't actually do a Passover meal, but we gave them some of the elements. We explained what the whole meal would have been like and the whole traditions and what the reasons were and how it starts at the beginning of the holy days. And we talked about the plan of salvation. It was what we call a model Seder or a teaching Seder. A Seder is the another way for describing the Passover meal. Seder means order, okay? And so, we have in this opportunity to do it on a different day. But don't do the whole thing. You're not actually doing Passover with them, but you can do an instructional where we bring out some matzah and we explain about some of the symbols by tradition that may be at a Passover meal. We explain that we use a thing called the Haggadah that is like the story and how it kind of walks us through the events and the meal. We explain about the 4 cups of wine, which by tradition matches up with where we were in Exodus 6:6. The 4 things: bringing you out, delivering you, redeeming you, and accepting you as my people. Okay, so the first cup is the cup of coming out. Okay, the second one is deliverance, the third one is redemption, and the fourth one is acceptance. Which, by the way, that's kind of the plan of salvation, right there in the 4 cups. Okay, and I wrote a Haggadah, which, by the way, will be free for you to download in PDF form on our website, on our Passover page, in the next, maybe by sometime this week, because I just remembered I needed to do that, and I talked to my webmaster, and I think we have it ready to put on there. So you'll have your own Haggadah you can do at home with. You can use it at home. So, but this all comes back to, oh, but you don't understand. We're reaching all these people. Really? How many of those people from all those churches show up to these giant Passovers actually started attending in Shabbat? I don't know, 0. I mean, it just doesn't happen. Okay? And the few that maybe do would have come anyway, separate, because they were actually gers, and they were being drawn, and they would have showed up anyway. They didn't show up just because you threw a Passover meal that they got invited to. It's just not. I'll give you an example. My parents, confession time. My parents, okay, by tradition, the Jewish community in the diaspora does Passover for 2 nights. Okay, there's a tradition to do all of the holy days for 2 nights, because the idea being in the diaspora, you might not know exactly when it is the right time in Jerusalem, so over the 2 days you'll catch it in there somewhere. Okay, that's the tradition. In Jerusalem, they still only do 1 night. And by the way, the only time they don't do this is for Yom Kippur. They're not going to fast for 2 days, but they do it for all of the other holy days. All right. So a lot of Jewish families, like my parents, have one of the nights. Usually, the first night is family only. Okay, or the second night, depends on the tradition. And the other night, they invite friends over. Okay, so everybody does their family one with just their family. Then the second night, they invite friends over. And a lot of times, they'll invite Gentile friends. Why? Because remember, we're talking about these are more secular Jews who are doing just a cultural tradition, and they don't understand Exodus chapter 12. Remember, I was raised in a house that had pork in it. Nobody was keeping Sabbath. I mean, of course, they still circumcised me on the 8th day. They still made me go to Hebrew school when I was 5 years old, 4 years old. They still made me get bar mitzvah at 13. But nobody's keeping anything, really. Okay? Oh, sure, we went to Trumpets and Atonement. Sure, we lit a few candles for Hanukkah, whatever, had a Seder. But now, I can tell you that in my life, for almost 50 years, there were Gentiles, and some of them have been coming to my parents' house for 20 straight years. And I can promise you, not a single one has ever decided they wanted to convert. 20 straight years of Passovers, and not a single one of these Gentiles has had any interest in becoming a Jew. It just doesn't do that. You know why? Because you know why they come every year? Because it's dinner and a show. It's like Jewish Thanksgiving on steroids. I mean, you think Thanksgiving's a lot of food? It's like a 15-course meal. You're going to explode at the end of this thing. And then you read the story and you sing some songs and you go through a whole bunch of stuff. It's dinner and a show. Why wouldn't anybody come to this? Great food, wine and everything. Yeah, of course they're going to come every year. They look forward to it. They want to make sure, when is it? I don't want to miss it. But they're not interested in becoming Torah observant. It's not going to convert anybody using this process. And so we have to, accept the reality. The reality is, you're not bringing anybody in by having a public Passover. What you are doing is breaking the Torah.
Wow. Dinner and a show. That's incredible. All right. From my background, I come out of the churchianity type of thing. And, Yeshua is always described as the Passover lamb, which that he is. What does that look like from what we're taught in that, as far as, Yeshua died, he did his thing, he was the Passover lamb. It's kind of like everything else, he fulfilled it. You don't necessarily need to do that no more. How do we justify that, as far as taking that for what it is and still acknowledging the Passover?
All right. Well, first of all, we have to understand that the disconnect is probably because nobody in church taught you that the first century believers all kept going to the temple until the temple was destroyed. Nobody's teaching that. So that would solve all of this ridiculousness. See, Yeshua doing everything he did changed nothing that any of the apostles, John or Peter or James or any of them, they all kept going to the temple every year and did their offerings every year and did the Passover with the lamb and everything every year until there was no temple, or until they got martyred and died, then they weren't doing anything. But, they were not stopping doing these things. But your church didn't teach you that. The church naturally just assumed, well, of course, all of this stuff stopped as soon as Yeshua died. This is clearly proven by Paul being required to not only do the Nazirite vow, but to pay for the costs of the other guys that were doing it also. The costs for what were the costs? The costs were of the animals for the offerings that you had to go to the temple with in completing your vow. And so the answer to all of that is that Yeshua, his death, burial, resurrection, affected the sacrificial system zero. Okay? End of story. They kept doing it and did not cease, not because they were wrong, but because it had nothing to do with it. You know, people will say, well, he was the end-all, be-all offering. No, first of all, there's nothing, when you read go to Leviticus, read the first 5 chapters, it talks about the offerings that they were required to do. There was nothing in there that he did or fulfilled specifically. As a matter of fact, he didn't die in the temple. He was outside. So if anything, as Rico points out, he's a friend of mine, you know, he was more connected to what he did to like the red heifer than to anything that had to do with the sacrificial system. Because he was outside the camp where they killed him. He wasn't in the camp. He wasn't in the temple. Because if he was the true Passover lamb, he would have gone in there. The high priest would have killed him in there. Now, as a metaphor, he was our Passover lamb. Why? Because the Passover lamb and the blood was part of the covering that protected you from death. So his death and his burial and resurrection is what also provides a covering for us today from eternal death. So there's a connection there. In the New Testament, in Revelation, we see he's referred to as the Lamb of God. We also see that in the Gospels, you know, behold the Lamb of God. Okay, so we see this lamb connection, yes. But lamb has to do with also pure and innocent. Okay, we see there's a lot of metaphors with lamb. It's not just Passover related. But he was also the one that was going to die and provide covering. Maybe that's the most simple way to put it.
The blood.
Right. By his death, the blood provides covering. Okay, the blood of that Passover lamb didn't provide any atonement. It provided covering. The Jews didn't have to do anything, and the Israelites, I should say, really, because the soul of Israel was there. In Egypt, didn't have to repent or do anything. They just had to put blood on the door. The blood provided a covering. And so we're explained that Yeshua, first of all, he gave his life for the whole world, not just for believers, quote unquote, providing an escape, a potential escape from death. And that's what the blood did. I mean, when people either did or didn't put the blood, if they put the blood, they escaped death. If they didn't escape death. So gaining access to the blood and knowing how the blood applies helps you escape death. Now, they were told to apply the blood on the doorposts and the lintels. We have to apply the blood in our lives. We do that through repentance and through commitment and through covenant. And so that's sort of the difference there. But we have to get away from, this idea that, I had people at a Sukkot, and there was a teacher there who taught about a third temple. One year I had somebody else teach, which is very rare for me to do, but I had someone else teaching, and they were teaching about a third temple. And I had I shouldn't say half, a good number of people wouldn't come to the second part of the teaching because they were so offended by the idea that there'd be a third temple and there'd be offerings in that third temple. Why? Oh, because Jesus was the end all of all of that. Where does it say that? Somebody please give me the verse that says that he ended all the offerings. I have never seen that verse. I've read the book, cover to cover, bunches of times. There's no verse. There's not a single verse that says when he died, all offerings were supposed to end. All the sacrifices. That he was the one for all, end all. He could not have been a human sacrifice. That's sin. He laid down his life. He allowed people to kill him. He was murdered. He was not a sacrifice. Because otherwise now we have a problem with the verses that are against human sacrifice. So if you want to say that his death somehow fulfilled all the sacrifices, well, now you're having a problem with Torah. Does that make any sense? He allowed them to kill him, to take upon himself all of the burden of all of the sin, of all of the need for death for all of us, by being sin for us, taking that penalty, and allowed people to judge him, who is clean and perfect, as if they were judging us. It's not a sacrifice. He laid down his life. And that's a whole different thing. Okay? And so offerings were different than sacrifice. He offered of himself. And so we have to understand that this is where the Christianity really misses the ball in trying to connect that somehow he, did away with and fulfilled, so there's no need for it. This idea of fulfilling is really the biggest problem for most people. Look, if I, okay, we have two things that kind of, we'll do this and then we probably should end here in a few minutes so we don't go too long. But if I, we want to kind of connect up two verses in Matthew and at the end of Matthew where, in the beginning of Matthew, he says, I didn't come to destroy, but to fulfill. And then at the end, he says, it is finished. As if he fulfilled, right? It's finished. Okay, now, if I tell you, Trey, or you, Daniel, I say, look, I want you to go and I want you to do this project. And when it's all finished, what do? You come to me and say, okay, it's done. It's finished. Now, if I gave, let's say the project is that we're building and decorating a sukkah. Okay, building and decorating a sukkah. And I say to Daniel, I want you and Trey to go and build the frame of the sukkah. Just the frame. We're not going to go ahead and decorate and finish anything else. We're just going to build the frame. So when you come to me and tell me it's finished, does that mean the sukkah's finished? No. It means just what you went to do was finished. Okay? It's like if you're building a house and I tell you to go ahead and get the pad prepared, the ground, and you make sure the ground is solid and you put the foundation in. Does that mean the house is finished when you tell me the foundation is done?
Just the
Yeshua, task. What was that?
Just the task.
Just the task. So when Yeshua said, Abba, it is finished, what was he saying was finished? What he came to do. After all, he was dying. Everything he came to do, he finished. He came to do certain things, and he did. So he didn't say anything else was finished, because see, here's the absurdity of Christianity with this. When he said it is finished, does that mean he's not coming back?
No.
Does it mean there's nothing more for him to do?
No.
So why is it that it only... What was that?
I said he has plenty to do.
So then why is it that Christianity chooses to say that it is finished means that it does away with all the things they don't want to do? Because that's all they're saying, is that he did away with the stuff we don't want to do. It's not finished. He finished his task in the flesh. What he came to do in the flesh, he did everything. He completed it perfectly. But he's not done. He's advocating, thankfully he's not done. Otherwise, he wouldn't be advocating for us at the right hand. He wouldn't be coming back to redeem us and to set up the kingdom. He wouldn't be doing all these other things. And so it's not even close to finished. But he completed his purpose and his task because his father sent him to do a task. And he said, Father, what you sent me to do? It's done. It's all finished. And so this is the problem, because people want to say, oh, he fulfilled this and he fulfilled that. He only fulfilled what he was supposed to do. I've said this over and over again, and I need you really to try to embrace this, please, everyone. He did everything he was supposed to do. He didn't do a single thing you're supposed to do. That's really important. He did absolutely everything that he came here to do. He did zero of what you're expected to do. See, Christianity wants to tell you he did everything he had to do and everything you have to do. That's the big lie. He didn't do anything you have to do. He did everything you can't do. There's a lot of stuff you can't do. He did those things. But everything you can do, he still wants you to do it. He expects you to do it.
Yeah, the obedience part to Torah. Okay. Trey, do you have any questions? I do have one question. I'll ask towards the end before we go off. But do you have any more questions for anybody from the chat room?
No, I didn't chat. Well, no, I don't have any more.
Okay. I have one. At the dinner, the whole Elijah chair thing. Can you kind of go over what that's about real quick?
Okay, I can do that. But before we do that, because that's actually just a Jewish tradition thing that they're not even sure, what they're doing. It has to do with. I'll explain in a minute. But before we do that, just to make sure that we do answer this piece, which is there's a lot to cover here. I cover it in 2 hours of teaching. It's free. It's called Passover Q&A. You can find it on the M.T.O.I YouTube page. You can find it on the mtoi.org website page. If you go to the teachings page, which is called Learn With Us, and you go to the teachings page, and so you can watch and listen. There's also notes that, there's a PDF of the notes, and you can look at the notes. The notes is really just sort of an outline with a list of verses in the order I went through it. It's kind of what I used today, so it's kind of, like this here. I don't know if people can see that a little bit. Of course, everything's mirror imaged here when you show it on the camera, so it's kind of backwards. But anyway, so I just want to make sure that we covered that, because I know there's a lot in this subject, and like I told you, I covered this very thoroughly in that teaching. And then if you have questions, you're certainly welcome to contact us, by email or Facebook or phone call or whatever you need to do. Now, to your question, there is instruction in the Talmud about using the 4 cups, the same 4 cups that I talk about. But also in the Talmud, there was a discussion about there being 5 cups. And that argument never really got settled in the Talmud about whether it should be 4 cups or 5 cups. And so there seems to be an understanding through time from people that have studied and have searched out these answers, that Elijah has a role of being the one that when he comes, because they believe Elijah's to come to be the precursor to the Messiah, that Elijah will be the one that settles all of these disputes of the things that we don't know. And so they put out this 5th cup for nobody, and they expect for that to be for Elijah. And so as a kid, we always joked about the Elijah cup, because you know what? It evaporates a little bit over time. So you look at it and say, oh, look, Elijah was drinking the cup. Look, it's a thing that the kids, and then of course, a tradition is to go and open the door after the meal to let Elijah in. Now, if Elijah's coming in some sort of, ethereal form, I don't think he needs to go through a door. But after all, we open the door for Elijah. And these are just traditions. It's to remember the mindset that they're waiting for Elijah to be the precursor to Mashiach. So as they await Mashiach, they're also awaiting Elijah. And so the idea of setting a place for Elijah and putting a cup is a part of that sort of understanding. Does that answer your question, Daniel?
Yes, it does. I was just curious, because I have heard a couple of explanations on it, and that's pretty much what I've always heard. And I was just curious.
Okay, we don't have that in our Haggadah. We don't do that at our Passovers. It's not a part of what we do. But this is a Jewish tradition. I was raised with that tradition. I never understood it either. What's this whole deal with Elijah? And it was a little scary as a kid going, well, what if, who's coming? Somebody's coming to the house, go open the door for Elijah. Who's Elijah? As a little kid, you're going out there to open the door.
Exactly. Okay. I have one more question, and this is from Curtis. And he wanted me to ask you this.
Curtis Reed?
Curtis Reed, yes. You'll get a kick out of it.
Is he watching now?
Yeah, he's watching.
All right.
Yeah, he's actually watching it. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. He said, given New Zealand is in the future, so will we be the first in the world to celebrate Passover, or does this make us more righteous?
Now, you know what? If you had just read that question, I would have already known it was from Curtis.
Yeah, he put a little thing in there. He says, make sure you tell him it's for me first. So I figured you would probably know.
I think that your head's gotten bigger and your cowboy hat's squeezing a little tight. No, I'm kidding. I'm just teasing. He's known for wearing this cowboy hat. Listen, I love you, Curtis. No, look, he's just doing that as a joke anyway, but it's just funny. But he, because he's, let's see, 24. He's 18 hours ahead of us. Okay, So right now it's almost 10 o'clock here. It's excuse me, so 6 back. So it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon tomorrow where he is. So that's kind of how things work and being in the future. Of course, whenever I tell Rabbi Tom, who works with me over here in Chattanooga, that I'm talking with Curtis, he always wants, because he's in the future, he always wants the lottery numbers, So Rabbi Tom's always asking me to tell him, give me the lottery numbers. I said, yeah, but they're going to be the lottery numbers in New Zealand. It's not going to help you any, So.
Hey, we got one more question in the chat if you wanted to hear it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So they said, when we keep the Passover, is it more like a memorial until we can actually keep it, how the Torah describes, as in Deuteronomy 16:2, it commands the lamb is slaughtered in the place Yahweh puts his name. Are the lambs we eat actually Passover lambs according to Torah?
Oh, yeah. No, we covered that earlier, and maybe you came in a little bit later, but yeah. The short answer to that is we're not doing any of those things at this time because they do require, when it says the lamb, where he placed the place, to bring the lamb to the place he puts his name, which once it became Jerusalem, that's where it became. So, of course, there's no need for us to go to Jerusalem right now because there's no temple and there's no priest, and you can't do that anyway. So until we have a temple and until we have proper priests and all these things in place, we are rehearsing. Now, having said that, we should be rehearsing to the best of our ability. We should be doing everything in our power as we rehearse to do what we can do, as full of rehearsal as we can. But it's the things that we can do that wouldn't be wrong to do. Now, there are verses that tell you it is wrong to do any of these offerings, including the lamb, in your backyard or just any place. There actually are verses that say you should not do this. So I know there are people here in the United States that are actually doing this, and they actually go through an offering of the lamb. They select it out on the 10th day, wait to the 14th day, and do this whole ritual. Okay, this is wrong. All right, according to Scripture, it's wrong. And there are also those that are painting blood on their doorposts. I'm sure they're very popular in their neighborhoods. Okay, with blood on their doorposts. But that is also not done today. As a matter of fact, it was only done once. It wasn't done ever since then. So at the moment, we are not keeping any feasts. We are rehearsing all feasts. To keep them, we need to go to Jerusalem and do them a certain way. But we are rehearsing them, hopefully, to the best of our ability so that we can glean all that we can glean out of the rehearsing. And so, I'll tell you something from maybe this is going to mess everybody up at the very end here. But I have a martial arts background, which, by the way, so do most of the teachers that I deal with in the Messianic movement. We all seem to have martial arts background. And I can tell you something that I taught, because I had a school I taught back in the 80s. And, actually, wow, it's 30 years ago that I stopped teaching. So that was a long time ago. It was 1987. But anyway, so what I always told the students is this. You do as you practice. If you're going to practice pulling your punches, when you go out in the real world, you'll probably pull your punch. That's why we wore pads and we did things in slower motion so we can get the right distances. So as you practice, so you do. If we don't practice, how are we going to do? And so we practice the feast, we rehearse the feast, and in doing so, we also go through the process of remembering the historical event that the feast is memorializing, because every one of the feasts is memorializing an event, right? We have Passover, the passing of the angel of death, so to speak, right? And them getting ready to leave. We've got the days of unleavened bread, and they're journeying out of Egypt. We have Shavuot, which is connected to both Mount Sinai and Acts chapter 2. We've got, and of course, you got Yeshua connected to the Passover and other things as well. You have, trumpets and atonement. They all have events that they memorialize. And then the same thing, obviously, with tabernacles, memorializes the dwelling for 40 years in the desert. Okay? So they have historical events. They have future fulfillments, which, by the way, in the idea of messianic fulfillments, the fall feasts have already been fulfilled, meaning he has already done the messianic counterpart to the historical event. We have his death and burial and resurrection to match up with the Passover. We've got the We've got the Shavuot in Acts chapter 2. We've got things that are fulfilled that way. We're waiting for trumpets, the return of Yeshua. Okay, so an atonement, and then tabernacling with the millennium. So we're still waiting for the fall feast. But each year when we rehearse these things, we go through the process of reminding ourselves of what happened and what's going to happen. And then we're also reminded of the personal connection to our walk. In other words, our personal journey out of Egypt, our personal redemption first with Passover, our redemption and then journeying out of Egypt, our ending up at Shavuot, at Sinai, receiving the Spirit and receiving the commandments, which are both, sort of Acts and Sinai matching up. And then you go through the process of how this is in your life. And we see those things. And I have a teaching series on that called actually it's a single teaching called The Appointed Times of Yahweh, but we're going to redo that soon here. And so you can look that up. It's called The Appointed Times of Yahweh. But so to answer that question, I think it's a good question to close with. I think it's important that we take every effort to observe these feasts to the best of our ability, knowing full well we're only doing it to the best of our ability. And that means that, you know what, if you know that you're not really fully covenanted yet, and I don't care if you went to Covenant Baptist Church or Covenant Pentecostal or every church has got covenant in their name, that doesn't mean you were covenanted. Okay? The covenant is he speaks, you obey. If you're going to a church that says what he said is done away with, you're not covenanted. I'm sorry. That's going to piss a lot of people off. It's just the truth. Okay? The covenant is the Torah obedience covenant. And so you can't say you're covenanted if you're told that it was done away with and you don't have to keep it. So, if you're still trying to get the pork out of your mouth while you're on Sunday worship and doing all these other things, you're not covenanted. And so you should not be taking the Passover. You're still transitioning. It's nothing negative. It's no condemnation. Nobody's judging you. At some point, all of us were not ready to just walk out of a church and next thing you know, be covenanted. There's a process. It takes time. And so there's no shame, and shame on anybody that makes anybody feel like, oh, I noticed you weren't at Passover. What's wrong with you? Well, you know what? No, give them credit. Be proud of them for self-editing to recognize that they shouldn't have been there. And then encourage them so that they can be ready for next year. That's what we ought to be doing. Appreciate that they self-edited. But you know what? If you're skipping Passover 3, 4, 5 years in a row, then something's wrong. You're not ready. For some reason, you're not ready to make those commitments. You've just dropped the ball on committing. And we need to kind of get past that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Well, in closing, can you go ahead and let everybody know how to get a hold of you, how to reach the teachings? Obviously, they're on YouTube and everything, but just kind of plug every place they can go to find out, especially like the Passover Q&A, so they can go to that and anything else that they would like to do.
Yeah, if you type in on YouTube, I think if you type in M.T.O.I. and then Passover Q&A, you should have the teaching pop right up. Or if you type up Steve Berkson and Passover Q&A, should pop right up. But if you go to the M.T.O.I. worldwide, M.T.O.I. YouTube page, you should be able to find that reasonably quickly. It's on the page there. You may have to search. There's over 400, 500 videos now on that page, but you can find it in there. I did a search for it earlier today because I wanted to just hear what I had said, just to listen to myself a little bit, just to kind of make sure I was reviewing for this meeting tonight. And I just typed in M.T.O.I. and Passover Q&A, and it came right up. And so we have a YouTube channel, and it's got everything I've ever done is on there. We have a Podomatic channel. It's steveberkson.podomatic.com. We have links to that on our website. The website is mtoi.org. M.T.O.I. stands for Messianic Torah Observant Israel, which I think is kind of the best description of what we really are. We believe in Messiah. We should be Torah observant, and that makes us Israel, essentially. That's the definition of Israel. And so that should be the best ways to reach us. My phone number for reaching the office is on our website. Email addresses. I have a Facebook page for M.T.O.I. That's a page you can like. We also have a personal page, Steve Berkson, on Facebook. You can always friend me on Facebook and use Messenger to talk to me. Email works as well. It's probably the least useful way to reach me since I get about 400 or 500 of those a day. So that gets tough. Okay, so that's not always the best way to reach me if you have something. And if it's urgent, then please mark it urgent in some way. But realize if it's just like, I get these every day, and I don't want to insult you if you're one of these people, but I get people saying, I got this one verse that's always bothered me. Do you know what this verse means? And it's always some obscure thing that really doesn't make any difference in anybody's walk, but it's something that's bothered them, which is legitimate. I understand that. But I'm not the Bible answer man. I'm here to help you walk out a walk. And so if you have an issue with your walk or the things that affect your walk, call me, email me. If it's just things you've always been looking for answers for, they really are not going to affect what you do every day, which basically I'm talking about two things: how you love him, your creator, and how you love us, the other people in the body. If it doesn't affect that, it's just one of these verses that you just never understood. All right. Okay. Like, for example, I appreciate that Trey brought up the Elijah question, but that would have been one of those emails that if I got it as an email, I would have been like, oh, I don't want to say it. I don't have time for those questions. And does that make sense? And again, it's nothing against, Daniel asking it in this kind of a form, but those are the kind of questions that if I get to it, I do. If I don't, I don't. Realize there are people that are having much more urgent needs about, how they deal with their family, Sabbath, feast keeping, kashrut, Torah issues, okay, than non-Torah issues, tradition issues, okay? So the Torah issues I do try to answer, and I'm better with phone calls. Just call. I mean, I know a lot of people are like, oh, but you're so busy. You're right. I'm busy helping other people that made the phone call. So you might as well be one of the ones that makes the phone call. Now, if you don't get me, you'll get Robert, my administrator. That's fine. If you really just need me and he can't answer the question, he will get you in touch with me. Okay? All right. So I really appreciated being here. It was great.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for coming on. We always enjoy hanging out with you and talking about these things that we need to learn more about anyway, because this is I guess going into 6 years for me. Yeah. And I'm still throwing sand in my own eyes. So, it's nice to have people that we can bounce things off of, and it's been walking this out that, we can get some of these things figured out. What I would like to ask is if you would lead us out in prayer. And then after that, Trey, if you have a couple things you need to say or whatever about, the page or whatever, we can do that. But and then we'd like you to stay on after we stop the broadcast.
Okay, we can do that. And also, since you mentioned 6 years, February was 30 years since I had committed to covenant, Torah observance, and Yeshua. So it was 1987 till now. So that was exciting for me. I haven't really done anything to make a big deal about it, but this is 30 years of walking Torah and in the context of Yeshua. Because even though I was raised in a Jewish house and everything, we didn't keep Torah very diligently at all. But my commitment to keep it really was always in the context of Yeshua when I really got serious about keeping it. And that commitment was when I got immersed. And that was in February of '87. So, so it's that's 30 years ago. It's hard for me to think, when you're young, it's hard to think about anything being 30 years ago. I'm sure Trey's thinking, what do you mean 30 years ago? I'm 19 years old. So, he's barely halfway there. But of course, Trey, I remember you being 3, so that's a whole different thing. But yeah, I mean, it's a sobering thing to realize that it's something that's gone on that long. So let's go ahead and close. Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, Father, we come before you, and we want to just pause and appreciate that you are the connecting cord between all of us. It's because of you that I know Trey and I know Daniel, and that those who are listening and watching are connected. They're all connected through you, and that you are, as I've been saying for a while now, that your whole thing is about a body of people that will live as a community, that you are drawing people together to fall in love with each other as we are falling in love with you. And so, Father, we understand that part of your way of teaching us that is through your feasts, and that the first one is coming up here as Passover, and that it's a part of your building of community and giving us a chance to learn about your plan in the context of community. And so, Father, as we grow to be your people, we ask your mercy and compassion and blessing, that you in your patience would correct us where we need correcting, encourage us where we need encouragement, and that you would strengthen us as we go through this walk in a world that is just not designed at this time to be very conducive to what you're doing. So, Father, we thank you. We appreciate you and all that you do. In the name above all names, Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen. Amen.
All right, amen. Thank you for coming on. I just wanted to let everybody know that the Passover Q&A playlist is down in the description below if you wanted to go find that. It's in the description. You can go to M.T.O.I's website in the description, the YouTube channel, and their Facebook page. Go ahead and subscribe to them and like their Facebook page if you want more from Rabbi Steve. And if your first time on is today, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Share this. It will be a blessing to like it if you enjoyed the content, and we'll see you guys.